Welcome back. This lecture continues our conversation about Article 2 of the Constitution, which focuses on America's presidency. It corresponds to Chapter 4 of the book, America's Constitution, a biography, which is our guidebook for this walking tour through the written Constitution. In our last session, we talked about how the presidency is vastly more powerful than anything that had existed under the Articles of Confederation at the federal level, and frankly, also vastly more powerful than anything that existed in the 13 states. Most state governments pick their chief executive by the legislature, but in America, the presidency is going to have an independent base of power. He's not picked by the legislature. In 10 of the 13 states, the governor has a 1-year term. This president is going to have a 4-year term. He's going to be, most states don't allow, or many states don't allow perpetual re-eligibility. This president is going to be perpetually re-eligible. Only one of the 13 states, New York, has a multi-year term and perpetual re-eligibility. That's a 3-year term for their governorship. The presidency is going to be even more powerful at 4. Only one of the states, Massachusetts, gives the governor and the governor alone a veto pen. The Constitution is going to give the president a veto pen. And so it's going to combine, in certain ways, the elements of the two strongest state governorships, the New York governorship, 3-year term, perpetual re-eligibility, the Massachusetts governorship, a veto pen in his own hand, and it's going to add all sorts of additional executive powers to this supremely powerful new office that's being created. An office, to repeat, vastly more powerful than any state governor, yet much more constrained than an English monarch. And we'll talk about those constraints as well. Let's talk just a bit about what the rules are for who can become president. So let's start with the property qualifications. That's right. None. 0. That's an important number. We've been talking about numbers. 0 are the property qualifications to be president. A person can be elected president even if he's not eligible to be state governor. And indeed, every state that has a governorship, Pennsylvania has a kind of a rotating executive council, but every state that has a single person as governor has considerable property qualifications for that office. And of course, in England, to be the chief executive, you have to be basically the wealthiest person in England, the monarch. But 0 property qualifications for the presidency, a radically democratic vision. Let's talk about religious qualifications. In England, you need to be the head of the state, the defender of the faith. In America, there are no religious qualifications for the presidency, and indeed a later provision of the Constitution says that in Article 6, there will be no religious tests for any federal office. This, too, is a dramatic contrast, not just with the rules in England at the time, but in the 13 states. Only one state, basically, has gotten rid of all religious qualifications. That's Virginia. In the vast number of state constitutions, religious qualifications, religious tests are not just permitted, they're built into the state constitution itself in about 10 of the states. So remarkable openness to talent. Now, the people will get to decide whom they choose, whom they have the most confidence in. No property qualifications, no religious qualifications. Now, there is that thought that you have that rule in Article 2 that a president must be a natural-born citizen, which means that he has to be a citizen at the day of his birth. He could have been born abroad. John McCain, for example, was born in the Panama Canal Zone. Mitt Romney's father, George Romney, who ran for president, was born in Mexico. But they were citizens on the day of their birth and therefore eligible. And you might think, well, that's kind of a real restriction on democracy. But in fact, and it may reflect some anti-immigrant sentiment, but let's remember some things. First of all, everyone who was already an American citizen, whether foreign-born or not, at the time of the Constitution, was eligible to be president. Alexander Hamilton was born outside the United States, not born, in effect, a citizen of the United States, but he was eligible to be president. James Wilson, we talked about him, from Scotland, born in Scotland. He's eligible to be president. Anyone who's proved their loyalty to the American system by being here in the American Revolution is eligible. They grandfather all those folks in. Far from being anti-immigrant, they're very pro-immigrant. 7 of the 39 people who draft the Constitution at Philadelphia are foreign-born. Vast numbers of foreign-born people participate in the act of ordainment and establishment that results in the Constitution. A third of the early Supreme Court justices are foreign-born, including James Wilson. 4 of the first 6 secretaries of the Treasury, including Alexander Hamilton and Albert Gallatin, are foreign-born. Roughly 1/10 of the first Congress is foreign-born. And remember, if you're a naturalized American who comes later to the United States after being born under some other flag, you are eligible to be in the House and the Senate and the judiciary. That's not true in England. In England, foreign-born people are basically perpetually ineligible to be a member of the House of Commons or House of Lords or Privy Council or hold any important position of honor, trust, and profit. But America's Constitution is open to a very broad range of immigrants, in part for national security reasons. We want folks to come, talented people, the framers did, to come from abroad and add their strength to the American project, to add their skills and their talents, their military capacity. We want them to come here, buy Western land, and help us in the next war, which we hope doesn't happen, but we fear might. And so it's quite actually a pro-immigration document. So why this special rule about the presidency? And I think the idea was ultimately, it was a democratic idea in part. They were concerned that a foreign earl or duke might come over with a boatload of gold and buy a presidential election, because there weren't campaign finance rules in place. They associated foreign-born chiefs of state with monarchy. George I was born outside of England. George II was born outside of England. Neither of them spoke English. So Americans tended to associate foreign-born heads of state with monarchy and aristocracy. And so they were worried that maybe some foreign aristocrat, the second or third son of George III or someone like that, the Bishop of Osnaburg, was going to come over with a huge posse, a retinue of people, a boatload of gold, and try to buy himself an election. So they created a specific rule and grandfathered in all the loyal Americans, whether foreign-born or American-born, who were here during the American Revolution, the Alexander Hamiltons of the world, the James Wilsons of the world. So we've talked about no property qualifications. We've talked about no religious qualifications. The natural-born citizen requirement is actually an egalitarian idea, an anti-aristocracy, anti-monarchy idea. What about this idea that a president has to be 35? Isn't that a restriction on the people's ability to choose the most virtuous person? Isn't that anti-democratic? Well, not quite, because the spirit there was actually pro-egalitarian. Who could get themselves elected president at the age of 33? What kind of person would have the name recognition to do that? Now, note that they're not thinking about any specific individual. This wasn't an effort to try to keep Alexander Hamilton out of the presidency immediately because he's only 33. Everyone understands, to repeat, that George Washington is going to be our first president if Virginia says yes, and he's going to continue to be president as long as he's willing to serve. So it's not trying to exclude anyone who's currently 31 or 32 when the Constitution is being considered. But there is a concern, more generally, about a certain kind of person, a famous son of a famous father. That's the kind of person who could get himself elected president, possibly at the age of 30 or 32 or 33. Who is the Prime Minister of England when they're coming up with these rules? And the answer is William Pitt the Younger, whose daddy was Prime Minister, William Pitt the Elder. And the colonists liked his daddy. Pittsburgh is named after William Pitt the Elder. But William Pitt the Younger becomes a member of Parliament at age 21 and Prime Minister at age 24. And he might be good and he might be bad, but he's getting it because of his daddy's name. And America's Constitution is trying to actually prevent that. Before you can be elected president, you should actually have a track record of your own So at 35, we'll know who you are. You can have held other offices. You can have been in the House or the Senate or state government or something else. You'll have a chance to show your stuff and be judged by your own merits. It's an anti-dynastic idea. And indeed, George Washington is picked as first president in important respects for anti-dynastic reasons. George Washington becomes father of his country because he's not father of his own children. And this is very well known. Washington himself says in an early version of his first inaugural address, an early draft, and he cut this out because he was advised by Madison that it was a little too personal. Here's what George Washington writes, in effect. And what he's saying, well, let me actually first read you the quote, and then I'll sort of translate. Divine providence, the good Lord, has not seen fit that my blood, this is Washington speaking, should be transmitted or my name perpetuated by the endearing, though sometimes seducing channel of immediate offspring. I have no child for whom I could wish to make a provision, no family to build in greatness on my country's ruins, no earthly consideration beyond the hope of rendering some little service to our parent country could have persuaded me to accept this appointment. That's what he says in his first draft of his first inaugural address. In other words, trust me, I'm not going to try to create a throne because I've got no one to give it to. There is no George II to give power to. And indeed, of the early presidents, you see, Thomas Jefferson, George Washington has no sons. Thomas Jefferson has no sons, at least legitimate ones that we know about who bear his name. I know little Tommy. James Madison has no sons. James Monroe has no sons. Now, John Adams, you see, has a son. And his name is Q, as in W. And his son does become president, but only well after he's 35 years old. He has a track record of his own. John Quincy Adams does. Distinguished scholar, diplomat, senator, secretary of state. When John Adams leaves office, little Johnny Q is not even old enough yet to be eligible in his own right. I'll tell you a couple of other sort of stories about their obsession, their concern with dynasty. Remember, these guys who framed the Constitution were born American colonists. They were breaking away from England. In England, power descends, is transmitted dynastically, from father to son or father to daughter, Henry VIII to Elizabeth. And they're trying to break with that. They've seen how, even in the House of Commons, so-called, power is transmitting dynastically from William Pitt the Elder to William Pitt the Younger, and they're trying to break with that. And they pick Washington in part because he is a break with dynasty. You can trust him because he's got no son to give a throne to. In the election between Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, why do people think, Jefferson's the Democrat, John Adams is a monarchist? John Adams is a farmer's son. Thomas Jefferson sits on a mountaintop lording over hundreds of slaves, and yet he's the man of the people? Why is that? Well, Jefferson is actually very good at public relations, but here's another thing. I'll read you actually from campaign literature in the 1796 election. Here's a Boston newspaper. It warns that Adams, if elected, would work to install his well-born sons as lords of this country. Jefferson, with daughters only, can be trusted. Here's another campaign sheet. Adams has sons who might aim to succeed their father. Jefferson, like Washington, has no son. So all of that kind of concern, anxiety about dynasty is kind of packed into this very compact phrase, 35 years. So it's actually quite a democratic. It's hugely powerful. The geostrategic argument that we've been talking about is embodied in the presidency, creating a muscular presidency who's going to be able to stand up against kings and emperors and czars around the world. But it's also, and that's one of our big themes, how geostrategic the Constitution is, how focused it is on national security. But remember another theme. is how democratic the document is. No property qualifications, no religious qualifications. This president's actually going to be elected in some ways by the people. I'm going to talk about that in just a minute with the Electoral College. And anti-dynastic rules, like the 35-year-old clause, anti-nobility rules, which is what the natural-born citizen idea is in its essence all about. We're going to pay him, this president, so that people without vast amounts of wealth could be eligible to serve, just as we're going to pay members of the House of Representatives and the Senate. Now, what about the Electoral College? You've been taught that they came up with an Electoral College rather than direct election because they didn't believe in democracy. But I've just given you a bunch of evidence that they really were Democrats at the founding. And they put the Constitution to a vote, we the people of the United States, an unprecedentedly inclusive vote. And they believe in direct election of governors, and they're actually creating a presidency that will be a model for direct election of governors. And they create a House of Representatives that's directly elected in a way that wasn't true of the Congress and the Articles of Confederation. So I don't think it's actually fair to say, oh, they created the Electoral College because they really didn't believe in democracy, because they were afraid of democratic power. So I don't think that actually explains the data. And you've been taught, oh, the Electoral College is a balance between large states and small states. Well, the House and the Senate, that's a balance between populous states and less populous states. But not the Electoral College. The Electoral College, the big state guy wins every time. We've only had 3 small state presidents in all of American history: Bill Clinton, Franklin Pierce, and Zachary Taylor. That's it. Remember, for the first president is from Virginia. That's the biggest state. And then actually Massachusetts is the next president. That's the second or third biggest state, depending on you count. And then Virginia again, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, James Monroe. For 32 of the first 36 years, it's Virginia, which is the biggest state. And for the other 4, it's Massachusetts. And then for the next 4, it's Massachusetts, which is the second or third biggest state, depending on how you count. It's not a balance between big and small states. It's not because they didn't believe in democracy. Here's what James Carville would tell you. It's slavery, stupid. That's why we have an Electoral College. In a world of direct election, the South loses every time because a huge proportion of its population is slave population. So obviously they don't vote. But in an Electoral College system, the South gets to count its slaves, albeit at a discount, the 3/5 clause, but still gets to count its slaves. So the 3/5 clause is built in not just to the House of Representatives, but the Electoral College as well. And it's going to end up with a presidency that ends up skewing very much in favor of the South. So who's the big winner in this Electoral College world? It's Virginia. It's a large state that gets to count its slaves. Pennsylvania in 1800 has more free citizens than Virginia. Way more voters than Virginia in 1800. But Virginia has more electoral votes because Virginia gets to count as slaves, as do all the southern states, 3/5. Our Electoral College system is basically very much part of the 3/5 compromise, very much a pro-slavery accommodation in the Constitution. If this wasn't crystal clear to every American when the Constitution was being proposed, it soon became so with 2 elections between a Southerner, Thomas Jefferson, and a Northerner, John Adams, as soon as George Washington leaves the scene. And the South votes for the Southerner twice, Thomas Jefferson, and the North votes for the Northerner, John Adams, twice. New York is the swing state. It first goes for Adams in 1796 and then for Jefferson later on. We're going to talk a lot about that election in later lectures, but it was clear to all that basically this is the South against the North, and the 3/5 clause is playing a huge part in all of that, as we're going to see in later chapters. Without 3/5, actually, John Adams wins even that second election. He loses against Jefferson in the rematch because Jefferson is benefiting from the extra 3/5 that the southern states are getting because 3/5 is built into the Electoral College. So we have the Electoral College for reasons of slavery. We're going to come back to this again and again because one question is, should we continue to have it if that's what it's all about? Now, I promised at the beginning of this session about the presidency that you're going to be able to see all the great themes of Article 2 in this painting. 1796, it's the Washington family. Let me just identify what some of those themes are, and you see here. So one, the presidency, it's a kind of a lonely office. The president here is not surrounded by other presidents. Remember, in our previous chapter, we saw Henry Clay, and he's up there in the Senate, and there's John C. Calhoun, and there's Daniel Webster. Congress is a collective body. President, one person, and he's got his family all around him, but there's not a Congress of presidents, and no one's quite looking directly at him. It's a bit of a lonely office, actually. So you see George Washington. And what's he wearing? He's wearing his general's uniform. You see, it's a geostrategic and military office. George Washington becomes the first president in part because partly because you can trust him, and I'll tell you, because he has no heir to the throne who bears his name, no George II, and we're going to talk about that in a minute, but partly because he had an army under his disposal and gave it up. He was the only guy with an army on the continent during the Revolutionary War, and in 1783 he hands his commission over. He disbands the army. He goes to the farm. You can trust him. He's a general. He'll be able to protect you against the British. You see this globe down here in the corner. It's a geostrategic office. It's all about foreign affairs. And he's wearing his general's uniform, but you can trust him because he's not going to try to create a stage a military coup d'etat. He could have done that during the American Revolution and didn't. He's not going to be a Napoleon. Napoleon hasn't quite emerged on the scene, but he's not going to be another. When Washington is elected, Napoleon hasn't emerged on the scene. By the time of this painting, actually, some Americans have begun to hear of Napoleon. But he's not going to become a Napoleon. A Julius Caesar is going to make himself Emperor Caesar. You can trust him. He's going to be big enough to go against the Brits. It's a foreign policy office to defend us. All the early presidents elected presidents are basically battlefield generals or secretaries of state. It's a foreign policy office. John Adams was in effect Secretary of State, a leading diplomat under the Articles of Confederation. Thomas Jefferson, Secretary of State. James Madison, James Monroe. All of the early elected presidents, all the way up until Lincoln, are either secretaries of state / America's leading diplomat or battlefield generals like Andy Jackson, like William Henry Harrison, like Franklin Pierce. The only elected president up to Lincoln who's not a leading diplomat or a battlefield general is James K. Polk. So it's a foreign policy office. It's it's commander-in-chief. It's about geostrategy. We see all of that. It's lonely here. It's a lonely office. We see the lurking presence of slavery in the corner. There's actually Billy Lee, Washington's favorite slave, whom he frees on his death, actually, setting a model, a precedent as ex-president, trying to set a model for his country that, alas, is not emulated by all the great slaveholders of Virginia. But Washington does provide for the freeing of his slaves, the ones that he owns at his death. And Billy Lee is one of them. But we see kind of the presence of slavery in this early presidency. One final thing, what we see and don't see. This is the Washington family, and this is a step-grandson, Augustus, a step-granddaughter. They do not bear the Washington name. They do not bear his blood. They are not going to be heirs to the throne. In some ways, the saddest feature of this, and there's a certain solemnity here, but also a certain maybe sadness, is there's an emptiness in the middle. What's not here? There's the rising SUN, the American Empire on the rise, sort of. So a rising SUN, a rising sun, but no SON. Washington has no kids of his own. And there's sort of sadness there. That's what he doesn't have. But precisely because of that, we can trust him. We can trust him because he's a military officer who could have made himself president but didn't, who can beat the British. We can trust him because he has no son of his own. He has a lot of wealth and power, partly because he is a Virginian who does own slaves and marries a very wealthy Virginia widow. So that's all part of it. But the anti-dynastic feature is here too. Maybe the most important part of this painting is what is not there, namely an heir to the throne. In our next sessions, we're going to talk more about America's presidency, so stay tuned.